Welcome to Book Time with Ryan. I'm Ryan, and today we're talking about Paul Horgan's A Distant Trumpet. This is the 30th anniversary edition. That book is the copy that I read, but if you saw my last video, I also had an unboxing of the first edition, first printing, signed copy right there. This was my first Western, and I really liked it. I gave this a 5. What is it about? It takes place in the 1880s, and most of it is in Fort Delivery, Arizona, the Arizona Territories. This is post-Civil War. I gotta step back. This book is divided into 4 books. The first book really talks about every character's background, and because of that, it makes it a little difficult to do the review because there are times where it goes back far enough for each character that it's easy to confuse their histories after the fact. Not while you're reading it, but giving yourself a couple days to let things kind of squish together in your mind. Because you see a lot of the characters go through their cadet days. You see them kind of grow up before their idea that they want to serve in the army. And a number of them either serve in the Civil War or are affected by the Civil War. So that's kind of book 1. Book 2 is really the process of our main character going to Fort Delivery after graduating from West Point, the military academy. Don't forget, I went to an academy. My academy was founded on the year that the main character in this book started at West Point. That was 1876. Coast Guard. That's book 2. Book 3 is really after the main action and what happens with our main character and the main kind of bad guy. I'll go into who these people are. And then book 4, or the conclusion, is really just everything after that. That's the short book. So, who are the main characters? Just briefly. Our main character is Matthew Hazard. Matthew Hazard is, for most of this book, a second lieutenant, and he graduated from West Point in, I think, 1880. And then he is assigned to Fort Delivery, which is an outpost as far into Indian Territory as any outpost. For the most part, a lot of the conflicts between the U.S. military and Indians, it seems like it's over, but there is a branch of the Apache Nation, the Chiricahuas, I believe they're called, that at times will attack settlers in the West. It's pretty brutal. It's pretty graphic. It's not overly graphic in this book, which was published in 1960, but it's pretty rough. We also see a general from his early days, from his kind of days growing up, courting his wife, her dying, and that's General Quaid, Major General Quaid. And we see a major, I think maybe a brevet major, which is an interesting concept. Brevet or brevet, I don't know which way it's pronounced. Essentially, in this time period, 1880s, 1870s, 1860s, there were temporary ranks. So you would have your permanent rank. Let's say my permanent rank was a second lieutenant, the most junior officer that you could be, besides a warrant officer, chief warrant officer. So you would have your permanent rank, but during the war or over certain periods of time, you could also become a brevet something. And you would carry the title, but you would get paid as your permanent rank, and eventually you would revert back to that permanent rank. I don't think it's really done. It's not done today because I Googled it. The closest we have to it today is something called frocking, which is where you're going to start at a unit that you would start at a certain rank, but you haven't actually made the rank yet. You've been selected for it, but you haven't made the rank. And you pin on that new rank, but you're still technically the old rank. It would be like if you're going to a unit and you're going to be the commanding officer, and the commanding officer is a certain rank, but you haven't actually put that on yet. And you would show up with that rank, but later on you would actually make the rank. The interesting thing is the public health service does have something where they have permanent ranks and temporary ranks, and it kind of feels a little bit like this, where somebody might be a lieutenant commander or a commander, but then they also have a position that's a rear admiral position. So their temporary position, their temporary rank would be the rear admiral, but they would eventually revert back to their permanent rank. It's interesting. We're following Matthew Hazard, Second Lieutenant Matthew Hazard, as he joins Fort Delivery. And at the time they're waiting for their commanding officer, which will eventually be Major Prescott, Hiram Prescott. And there is a first lieutenant in charge. He's the acting commander of the fort, Maine Waring. And Maine Waring's wife is there. Her name's Kitty. And she is a very flawed character. A bit of a tease. All the characters in this book are flawed in some way, but realistically, which is good to see. And there's also a base surgeon, Gray, Major Gray, who also becomes a line officer later, takes a hit in the rank department and becomes Captain Gray. We see the process of Matthew courting his wife, his future wife, Laura, the way he leads, the way he is an officer, the way he handles situations on his base, especially with a very weak acting commanding officer, Maine Waring, First Lieutenant Maine Waring, and the major issues from Maine Waring's wife, who seems to have some pretty serious issues of her own, Kitty. What it's like when Matthew Hazard's wife comes and has a baby on base. What it's like when the new major comes, Hiram Prescott. Out of all the characters, I think there's a few really good ones that you will really appreciate, that I really liked. Our main character, Matthew Hazard, is a great character. He has some flaws. There are times where he makes decisions that you wish he wouldn't make. But for the most part, he's making good decisions. And he's a good example of an officer that should go far. Maine Waring, not a good officer. His wife, really difficult. Really makes issues on base. Hiram Prescott, the major, the commanding officer, who shows up eventually. Great guy. His wife, Jessica, awesome. Really, the kind of first couple of the fort, really great group of people. Cedric Gray, major, as the surgeon, and then when he becomes a line officer, Captain Gray. Good guy. A little cranky, but good, and his wife is good too. Major General Quaid, eccentric, but really knows the way of the West. And one of my favorite characters is the Apache scout who had been captured early on in the book and was given the option of either staying in jail or becoming a scout with the trust of the U.S. Army. And that's what he does. His name is Whitehorn. That's his Apache name. He gets the nickname in the troop as Joe Dummy, which is a derogatory, kind of a mean thing to call him. He's not a dummy. But he ends up being Matthew Hazard's scout, his Apache scout. And Matthew Hazard gives him the trust that he needs to give him, and Whitehorn earns it and does a great job. there is a bad guy, a chief, Apache chief, kind of the last real war fighter, named Rainbow Sun. I don't know if he's supposed to be kind of modeled after Geronimo. I'm not sure. But he is leading attacks on settlers in Arizona and New Mexico from Mexico. And they have raiding parties that go out and just destroy small groups of American settlers. Really rough stuff. Some pretty disgusting mutilation, torture. And this book is really the response to that. So it is the response from Fort Delivery to tackle these attacks. You see a lot of the on-base politics, which it's a small base, small fort, so there's not a crazy amount of that. And then just the approach to confronting this final Apache resistance. And it culminates with Matthew Hazard and his scout, Whitehorn, going to Mexico to negotiate with Rainbow Sun for Rainbow Sun's surrender, unconditional surrender, and moving the Apache people to Florida until the president makes a decision on what to do with Rainbow Sun and his people. And that's where we are. So book 3 in this book is really that process of dealing with Rainbow Sun and his people, what they're going to do. And then book 4 is after that decision, and Fort Delivery has been closed because the kind of the Indian Wars are over. This final holdout group from the Apache Nation has surrendered, and we get to see what's going to happen with First Lieutenant Hazard and his family and the general after the Apaches have been resettled to Florida, and what has happened to Whitehorn, and how the actions that come after all these promises from Matthew Hazard, how they affect Matthew's life and his career. I don't want to give a whole lot away, but as with history, there are a lot of things that happen that you wish happened differently. And even the heroes of this book do not always come out perfectly, and the villains don't always come out bad. I think Paul Horgan does a good job of showing that there's a lot of gray area. There's a lot of real concerns for the people of the Apache Nation by Apache leadership. There have been a lot of violations and things that have happened to the Apaches that would cause them to doubt the sincerity or the honor of the American government. There are plenty of things that the Apaches have done to settlers in the Southwest that would cause the U.S. government to take action. There is honor between different groups, even when they're on opposite sides of a conflict, seeing each other as warriors. But there's also a very brutal side of it too. And I think Paul Horgan does a good job of exposing both. No one's hands are clean. No one's entirely dirty. Everyone has a good and a bad side. The entire situation has legitimate purposes, legitimate concerns, but also a lot of distrust, and for good reason. And that's what this book is. I did an unboxing of the first edition, first printing of A Distant Trumpet, but I said this in the unboxing. This painting on the cover of the 30th anniversary edition is what Fort Delivery would have looked like. There's a description in the book of the different houses and the setup of the fort, and this is what it is, because I went back and forth through the description and the cover, and I thought that was just so cool. And it really allowed you to kind of picture what was happening in the book a lot more as they were describing where people were coming out of and where they were walking, or it just, look how isolated that looks and how vulnerable I think it looks. And they were vulnerable. They would be vulnerable to a large raiding party. Not a small group, but if you had 100 Indians attacking this, there is a very good chance that they would have lost. And this is not like a fort that you picture from the Revolutionary War. I also found that I was not entirely aware of when these kind of Westerns would take place. I brought this up on a kind of a sprint, I think, on somebody else's sprint, about how confusing it can be. And Margaret Pinard kind of talked about how you condense these time periods. So I think about the Indians from Last Mohicans and Huron. And I think about these Indians, and you kind of think like, no, lump them together. These are the same periods. These are the same kinds of things happening. But the reality was, Last Mohicans started, it really took place 100 years before this 1880s period, which was 100 years before around when I was born. These are pretty major periods of time, and you just kind of see the same kinds of conflict, different things. Last Mohicans was French and Indian War, so it was colonists in England fighting the French and their native allies in North America. A Distant Trumpet is post-Civil War and the greater expansion west. A lot of when we think of expansions west earlier was really expanding into the eastern states. So the really far west at that point was like Pittsburgh, Pennsylvania, or Ohio. Conestoga wagons couldn't go west. So when you think of the really big wagons for Western movement, it was really just mid-Atlantic states and some of the further west of the eastern states, the eastern seaboard, and much earlier in time. This is much later in time. Surprisingly to me, much, much later, so close to the 1900s, that this was still going on. And there is a lot of abuse, and there is a lot of misunderstanding or painting entire cultures a certain way. I think that Paul Horgan does a decent job of trying to show that there are multiple sides to issues. There are people that are tortured, but there are also groups of people who are lied to continuously. And why would there be trust? And if they're defending their livelihood and their kind of their status, their people, that's a kind of a wartime setting for them. Even if the much larger power of the United States saw it as just raids on innocent settlers. Paul Horgan was in the Army, so he has some experience with that. He went to the New Mexico Military Institute, I guess in high school, or is that junior college? I don't know. But he was in the Army, so he has some idea of kind of the structure of the military and the rank structure and the approach. But also he's dealing with a period of time where the Army was very different too, and the discipline of the Army was very different. I liked it so much, enough that I bought another copy, and I will be giving away the copy that I read. I also have to say I used different trumpet bugle calls in this video. I also did that for the unboxing. Originally I used a Neil Young song in the unboxing, but that was blocked. It's my first time I've actually had a song blocked that I used for a video, so I had to take down that video and add something else, and I put in the trumpet military kind of CD album, whatever. As a cadet, we had reveille and we had taps. We had all different patterns, whatever they're called. I forget now. Reveille was the worst because that's what woke you up. Taps, a lot of people associate taps with funerals, but taps is also what we would play at the end of the day before we went to sleep, lights out. So reveille was like torture and taps was like relief. And it's interesting to hear those two tunes later because it still brings back those memories of like, oh shit, the day's starting. There's no snooze button on reveille, but when you could hear those taps, how relaxing that was, because it was finally going to be quiet in the barracks. finally have a chance to go to sleep. It was a little different on a ship, but at least on land, we had those, I guess they were CDs that had all that built onto it, and they would just play it at night and in the morning. That's it. My first Western, A Distant Trumpet. Loved it. 5 stars. Paul Horgan, great job. If you haven't looked at the unboxing of this book, really, which is up on the bookshelf now, check it out, because it was a very cool book to unbox, and there was some extra flair in the box that came with the book, and it was very cool to see. So thanks for being here today. I will now see you out with a little bit of taps, lights out, go to sleep.